To begin with, I'm very, very pleased to welcome the General Director of the Swedish Innovation Agency, Mrs. Darja Isaksson, back to Linköping. And there's so many ways to describe you, but you are a visionary and you are a digital expert. You work with innovation and you are such a smart person. I'm so happy to have you here. Please give her a big, warm welcome.
Being called smart in a room like this makes me really nervous. I'd like to dive into the transhumanism theme, but I'll stick with my material for now. So, being asked to talk about technology with a purpose, which is the theme for today, I wanted to start with a personal reflection. I remember the first time that I personally experienced that technology had a purpose for me. So that was back in 1990-ish. I was a young teenager. And my father let me solder together optical sensors with my cassette deck player so that anyone who would come into my room could hear my recorded voice say, "Get out of here." And I felt so empowered, and it really meant that from that time on, and for quite a foreseeable future, technology's purpose for me was self-realization and self-expression, giving me tools to have an impact on the world around me. Fast forwarding a couple of years, when I was leading my first company, we were designing digital services used by tens of millions of people. And then it was very clear to me that technology had the purpose of building better businesses. And, by the way, connecting people and creating a lot of things that I was hoping would be very interesting, and that had really changed my life around because I grew up in the northern Sweden, and getting access to world of knowledge and people outside of this little rural city had meant a lot to me personally. But then, things moved on. So I'm still in the personal perspective here, but we began to see some of at least the digital technologies, how it impacted our society in ways that we had, for instance, some people perceived in a way, but it was starting to hurt us. It wasn't that long ago that we actually saw a leading person with a global reach of a company having really impact in the world, having this attitude towards what kind of impact that technology had, saying, personally, I think the idea that fake news on Facebook influenced the election is crazy. So what this kind of was a wake-up call, I believe, to the world was that we are using technologies that scale really fast, have a big impact on society, but we do not even the people leading these organizations, do necessarily understand in advance how it will impact society, what kind of new vulnerabilities that come with it. And I think, in a way, we know that even more now. So we see technologies that will increase exponentially the potential damage that can be done to society, to the trust between us, to how we actually act together. For instance, deepfakes are really impacting what can we trust? Not only do we trust, but what can be trusted. We understand that consumer technologies that are being spread really quickly, that can give us a lot of comfort and convenience, can also be abused and is being abused. So some of the things might not seem that dangerous. Police break into German man's house after music device held a party on its own, so that was Alexa going a bit bananas. But when you put that alongside this type of headline, where we know that we have now begun to see well-funded, structural, long-term, patient cyber assaults on critical infrastructure, where the experts that look into that are completely convinced that this is something we'll see more of. So there were some really alarming headlines coming up where we have seen the first assault with a clearly deathly potential and goal being aimed at chemical plants in Saudi Arabia. So we're becoming we are creating new vulnerabilities to cybercrime, to biases, that where I think this audience, this is nothing new, we see that it's not that easy to create the algorithms that give us the outcomes that we want. We're training them on old data, we don't necessarily have all the tools we need, and therefore the consequences are already being seen in workplaces all over the world where solutions that are meant to reduce bias and increase efficiency are actually not giving the results that we want. So I think that there are many, many reasons why we are at the point in time where we are having this discussion quite a lot. Like, what is the purpose of technology, and how can we, acknowledging that we are now building new vulnerabilities into the world, learn how to address them in a responsible manner? So from my perspective, the fact that we create new vulnerabilities with technology is obvious, but it's nothing new in itself. So when we went to using electricity in the entire society, we became highly vulnerable to things that we weren't before. I'll give you one example. So I'll think about my grandfather. He grew up in Sweden almost 100 years ago. He was the kind of guy who could basically go into the woods with a knife and come back 6 months later fairly healthy. He would kill a moose or something like that. Me, on the other hand, if the port in Rotterdam gets a problem and shuts down, me and my children will starve within 2 weeks because there won't be food in the store across the street. And basically, I don't have the skill sets to survive in a world like that. But I don't lie awake at night worrying about the port in Rotterdam, because I grew up in a society where I have many good reasons to trust that we have created the regulations, the institutions, and the processes that we need to handle that vulnerability in a fairly responsible manner. Doesn't mean that this can never happen, just means that it's, the probabilities are low enough so that I can sleep well at night. And we understand that now that we are building this new powerful technologies everywhere, we need to do that again. We need to use the technology to create the sustainable society that we need, but at the same time, acknowledge and learn about the vulnerabilities that create while we create them, and learn about how can we handle these in a responsible manner. And that requires something else. It requires new ways of working. It requires us to address things at the systems scale as well, because the consequences are not just anecdotal, business per business, or even country per country, but will become systematic. So I'll give you one example. For instance, the great innovations in something as simple as ride sharing, where we have seen Uber and Lyft grow really, really fast, simply by making it very easy for consumers to make the choice of using this and having the business model to incentivize drivers to be available all the time. The consequences have been increased congestion in the cities where they have grown the most, not only because of the ride sharing, but also because of changes in behavior. That we don't only hail rides more, but we also require more things to be delivered to us at home. So if we take these trends alongside each other, how our mobility patterns change, how they offer to us as consumers change, and how our demand changes for having things sent home, then suddenly we realize that we might look at a completely opposite outcome on a city level than the one we actually need and want. And that's pretty serious. Because right now we understand that we don't have time for that kind of large-scale mistakes to happen. We need to address this right now. Because I think that the reason why we're here, and the reason why we're talking about technology with a purpose, is not only that we have begun to see that we're creating new vulnerabilities, but it is because we are, in effect, running out of time. There is no chance that the next mandate period for any politician, or the next budget period, can be the same business as usual. There is no way that we can continue to pretend that all the great ways of working that got us here is enough to take us further. So the way that we have been researching and creating business, etc., has been fantastic. It has brought us health and wealth everywhere. But at the same time, it has created a society that right now urgently needs to be redesigned at its core. Every value chain, every city, every consumption pattern must be turned into something sustainable. And it's also something that is so urgent that we all need to address, that this is not something where we can wait for the young leaders protesting on the streets. It's not something where we can hope that our kids will be wiser than us. It's not something where we can expect them to change habits. It's about us changing our behavior, our ways of making decisions, and our business models now. And then, on the positive note, we know that we can do it. We know that what took humanity this far was, in fact, our ability to communicate and collaborate and innovate. And we also know that we have right now the global language of what needs to be done. We have all the technology we need to do the first cut in carbon dioxide, the first halvening of carbon dioxide. There is no new technology really needed for that. It's only about us applying what we already have and what we already know, and using the time then to create the new solutions and new innovations we need to keep that further. I'm very, very hopeful, in fact, not only, well, in part because it needs to be a responsible moral choice, anything else will demoralize, but also because it is possible. Especially if we look at countries where we understand in Europe we have a width of industrial global leaders who mean serious business when they say that their future competitive advantage lies in solving real societal challenges. And if you mean that, if you acknowledge that there is no sustainable business outside of solving these challenges, but then you have something really, really strong. Then, speaking as the Director General of this innovation agency, I can also feel kind of happy to say we also know that this is not a research versus industry versus, it's something we're all in together. So what we know is that state has for a long time played an important role in enabling innovation that is important. So this is a picture that Mariana Mazzucato often shows, how an innovation that no one can deny was a huge entrepreneurial, innovative endeavor that really changed all of our lives in the sense that it has changed our behavior, our expectations, it has changed business models all over the world. Could not have happened without a large number of long-term, well-financed, state-funded research efforts in many, many areas. And it's not to diminish any effort, it's just that one would not have happened without the other, and we know that. We know that we need to address research and innovation both from a long-term, curiosity-driven and a short-term, needs-based perspective, and we need to be ambitious about both. But we also understand that this requires us to collaborate in even closer and even more open and even new ways than before. So I'll just give you one example. When innovating vehicles like this, it requires policymakers to get their fingers dirty in a way that we didn't before. Because we can't create this without at the same time exploring what kind of policy and regulation will this require, what will really help. So we're seeing countries all over the world, such as Singapore and France, and I think Finland and Estonia, for instance, creating these new tools in terms of how can we work with experimental regulation to just in a risk managed in a kind of a, where we have an idea of how big a risk we're taking, we can explore what kind of impacts we get on a city level or on a society level, and then we can learn from that before we take it further. So I think that's a really interesting thing. And Vinnova, we also see that. Bringing regulatory agencies into this process allows them as well to learn more about what needs to happen next. That's why I'm proud. And another thing that we do is that we make sure that innovation and research doesn't just happen in one place. I was just recently listening to a professor in macroeconomics saying, I'm sorry, but we were wrong. We were talking about the places that matter and the places that don't, in terms of all growth coming from very few regions in the world. So typically it's in Paris in France or Stockholm in Sweden, etc. But he said that we understand now that we were wrong because we really need to make sure, in order to have inclusive and resilient growth, we need dynamic regions everywhere. And I think Sweden at least is a great example of that we have many strong, innovative regions that have a lot to offer to the world, in fact, in many places of the country. We also see that as a state funding agency, we can also help by financing the infrastructures that we all need that make it possible to collaborate in new ways, not least between big companies and small companies and across academia and industry. So I'll give you one example that I think is great, is Testa Center. It's a pharmaceutical production facility open to everyone. So when you have an innovative idea aimed at medical production, you can go there and you can try it out, shortening the time to find your product market fit, getting you access to potential new customers, to expertise within that field, etc. I think that this is just one of many good examples that we need to see more of. And then we can also develop now how we learn together. So Ignite was an interesting thing that we did in Sweden that was a process that ran over all the incubators in the country. So you had a similar learning process all over the country where big companies came and exposed what their business needs are, and there was a matching process to small companies. What if we could find ways of improving these types of processes so that they are really clearly designed for learning and for maximum learning across, so that it's we really take advantage of what's happening in every single place. And then again, we need to pool our resources in order to make things happen. So AI Innovation of Sweden is the joint umbrella of the innovation effort in AI in Sweden, where the first node coming out is building capacity for having the infrastructure needed for industry to be able to come with the data sets to a trusted environment. On-prem, if that's what they require, shareable for the entire AI Innovation of Sweden or with Europe, if that's what they require, access to people with the skill sets in the data factory to annotate and make it available, etc., etc. So not going at this alone, but rather building it as national infrastructure from the beginning, I think will be key. And not least because we know that many of these efforts require both deep domain expertise that you have within industry and crossing that with other skill sets that you don't necessarily find in every country. So it will be interesting to see how we can scale these things across Europe in an even more efficient way. Because after all, Sweden, we're well aware, with 10 million people, we're not really a country, we're a city. And we need to provide value. And I think that some of my friends from Estonia and Lithuania will relate to that. So that's why it's also important that every effort that we make, we design with a global idea in mind from the beginning. So it's highly valuable to see all the research projects finding ways of connecting to each other, especially across Europe. I think I might be running out of time a little bit. What I wanted to say is that we all have different strengths. So for instance, the Nordic countries, we have a cold climate, we have a lot of clean energy, we have a lot of knowledge needed. So in a world where we need to evolve our connected cloud services, our data centers, or not the least, the connection to how we handle energy, I think that we should be able to do a lot because we understand, again, that we need this type of technology to get the energy systems that we need. There is just no way that we can have the mobility systems that we need or the cities that we need unless we have this kind of smart applications that make us handle intermittent energy resources. So I said before, we need to change every single value chain out there. There are some patterns as to what's happening. And one of the patterns is that regardless of what sector we're looking into, technologies such as robotics, AI, automation is changing the business model around, creating a new landscape where there are completely new companies coming in, adding value in new ways. And that's where I think we need to be able to see what's generic in that, in terms of we need to evolve how we share data in a secure way, in how to address cybersecurity, and how we actually build these types of ecosystems. And what's really interesting about it is if we can manage to find things that can move across different sectors. So one of the things that concerns me sometimes is like, how many times can we try to solve the same problem with a similar technology just because we're addressing it from a sectorial approach? Wouldn't it be more efficient if we would really think about how we design our processes and our projects and the transparency between our efforts so that we can make use of what's happened in agriculture in a completely different sector? Because we know, in effect, let's just say, predictive maintenance is relevant everywhere, so we can solve it only so many times. And I think also that we need to address transparency in a whole different level, and we're not used to that in industry. So if I could dream, I would have wanted for a long time now that as a consumer, I would have a consumer right to make a climate-informed purchase decision every day. So we know that we're investing in data in all the value chains. We're using it to make our supply chain more efficient, but we're not using it to empower individuals to make more better decisions in the way that we should. So if there would be a law that would require me to be allowed to make a climate-informed decision, I think we could have a different discussion, or that we really need to have, about how can I be, what is the solidarity in terms of the carbon footprint on my individual level. It can be done, the technology is there, we're not doing it. And what we know is that we can't solve these problems ever through a sectorial approach. So I have this picture of the mobility system. Well, the kind of mobility system that we need right now is not, we know that it needs to be electric, at least in cities, etc. We can talk about the long transport. We know that it needs to be mobility as a service, because when we can combine the scooters with the public sector and with the public transport, etc., we can make smarter choices. But it also needs to make us, in one way, travel less, and in the other way also move around more. Because the mobility system is highly interconnected with the health challenges that we also face. So when we design cities that make it, and mobility systems that make us not need to walk, we are actually designing a society that is very expensive. Because next to this, we have the demographic challenges. We just heard, we're now saving lives at a scale that we never did before. So what used to kill us at scale doesn't kill us any longer, and that's expensive. So let's take one example. Welfare states are completely now dependent on us being able to curb the growth of preventable lifestyle diseases, such as diabetes. If we want to do that in a preventive way, there is no way we will solve that through healthcare. If we want people to not get diabetes, they need to walk more throughout their entire life. We need to eat differently throughout their entire lives, and that's not something we solve with healthcare. That's something we solve with coming back to, the stores where we increasingly buy our food online and how they nudge our every day-to-day food decisions. It's about how we design our cities for walking rather than taking a car. So in order to really address societal challenges at scale, we have to have a cross-sectoral approach. We have to find ways of approaching this from completely different angles in many, many ways. So that's why I would like to come to this conclusion. I do believe that one of the most important innovations of our generation has to be the innovations of how we innovate together. And I have some research to back that up. But if you talk about innovation policy and what has been motivating governments to spend money on research and innovation throughout the years, there's a certain history to that we can talk about. Not meaning that the first school is irrelevant, because it's not, but the first insight was that we need to spend taxpayers' money on innovation because otherwise we have a too limited experimental economy. There's simply not enough incentive in the market to create all the experiments needed. Or there's just underinvestment in R&D and innovation. I think this is all familiar to you. And then we have a school where we started understanding that it's also about network failures, too little cooperation. So that's why we have now for some time been talking about co-creation, how we work together. But then looking at where we are right now, we're saying that in order to use innovation to solve the kind of challenges that we're facing, we have new types of challenges. There are challenges related to directionality, demand, policy coordination. And it's the kind of ways of working and investing that address these challenges that is what we need to learn and do more of right now, because this other stuff we know a bit about how to manage. And that's why I would like to quote Mariana Mazzucato when she says, all innovation has both a rate and a direction. And I think that's very interesting, because then we can talk about what kind of direction. What does it take to get us to have all the innovation vectors in society pointing in the direction where it actually matters? This is why the European Union, in their next framework program, is talking about the need for a missions-driven approach. For an approach where we can all articulate, we have the SDGs as goals, but we need to break them, to articulate them in goals that are cross-sectoral, clearly measurable, that we understand when we got there and not, a man to the moon and back, or not. Where we can after that look at what kind of challenges lie under that, where we can start mobilizing our bottom-up efforts towards these type of ambitious goals together. This is also one of the keys, we believe, to be able to communicate the reason and the value and the purpose of the innovation that we're doing to everybody. This is also one of the keys to be able to mobilize in an inclusive way where we can get civil society involved. Because if we want this to happen, the innovation can't be something for academia and industry. It has to be something where we really include people on a city level, on a regional level, and that they take part in it. So I would like to finish up with that. If all innovation does have a direction, what's yours? And I'm really, really hoping that it's a clear direction of being honest about what's stopping innovation in the ecosystem where you are from making larger impact. And then working towards getting it aligned to what the societal challenges really are. Thank you.
So didn't I say she was quite a smart person? Yeah. I like what you're ending with, Darja. You are talking about including different disciplines into the discussion. And we have begun to try out the term multi-helix instead of triple helix or quadruple helix, which is usually common in our discussions. But multi-helix be including everyone that has something to contribute with, I think. What do you think about the term multi-helix?
Yeah, well, I guess that that's the key point. We can't just, it's not so much about our academia, industry, or civil society, rather than the people that we need. And I think that one thing that we clearly see is a lot of the solutions that we need right now needs to include local municipality level, for instance, which requires a different type of dialogue with the people living there, but also the policymakers, etc., because that has a lot to do with the demand side.
So to break the silos that you are talking about, where do you begin to break the silos when you are integrated in a political system on a national or regional and municipal?
You know, it's just really hard for me to say what somebody else could do. I just made the reflection when I was in a meeting with other director generals that many of them were saying, I really wish that government would tell me that I had to work on Agenda 2030. It's like, why? I don't need that. In my regulation, in the letter where it says what government expects me to do, it says that I'm expected to help develop the innovation system in Sweden. I know for a fact that all director generals have a saying that we're required to help develop the system further. So I don't see why we would need that.
Yeah,
so I guess my reflection is, if we're serious about this, one of the things we need to do is to be honest about, are we maxing out on our mandate towards what is really needed? Do we dare to take a risk to be slightly outside of that? Or are we simply waiting for somebody else to take the responsibility of telling us that we have to do this? And that's a personal choice that everyone can make.
I think it's a very important choice, of course.
Yeah. But then also that requires taking risk. I mean, every cross-sectoral, every new type of collaboration, every time you invite somebody, a discipline that you haven't worked with, a country that you haven't worked with, every time that we choose to include a new person or a new perspective, it's painful. It feels inefficient, messy. And I just think that that's a level of discomfort that we need to acknowledge and be comfortable with.
Really important, not always have aiming on the result, but actually having a process that allows you to reflect and have different opinions.
And process is very important. Yeah.
So on a European level, do you think that we are innovative? And if you compare to the globe and what's happening in the US and China, how can Europe become more relevant and competitive? Do you have any ideas?
Well, there is so much that we need to do. So we have strengths, obviously, and that's the usual ones, and for this audience, but we have really strong research, we have research infrastructure, we have fantastic industrial leading companies, a number of those things. What we also, I think, have is hopefully critical mass of a population that wants this to happen, who are willing to invest and willing to be part of it. So it depends on what kind of level we're talking about. We now have, through the next framework program, also a really ambitious effort to create this type of directionality that we believe has been lacking. So I think that's a really interesting thing. And what will make the difference is whether we step into that or not. Whether we choose to see that as just some extra fuzz on top of it, or if we're serious about, yes, we want these missions to matter to everything that we do, then we can actually make this type of directionality happen in Europe. Obviously, there are many things that we need to to step up in terms of, you know, the fragmentation of regulatory approaches, the fragmentation of we don't really manage to scale things due to language barriers, regulatory barriers. We don't really share data the way we should, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many, many things that we need to address. But I'm hoping that at least we can use this type of tool.